I think it's important at this point just to not to speak ill of the dead, but because of media and mainstream movies and things of that nature, John Tunstall is typically portrayed as this good guy. He wanted to come in and rid the county of the monopoly that L.G. Murphy, Jimmy Dolan, and John Riley had over the county. In reality, he wanted to replace them. He's very clear in his letters that he wants to start his own ring. He wants to replace them and be that person. The big difference is, and he'll find this out shortly there after starting his store, he was not necessarily willing to resort to violence. The others were. And that was really what set them apart. He, right into the end, probably the reason he died on February 18th was because he was still believing in the legal avenues that were available to him. And they just continuously failed him. We'll talk a little bit about that. So, John Tunstall gets into legal trouble through his business associates. The Santa Fe ring had a lot of different mechanisms by which they could destroy somebody. The legal system was probably their best and their favorite because they had in their pocket people like Warren Bristol and William Reinerson, who are attorney generals or district attorneys in the territory. John Tunstall's business partner, not on paper but by handshake, Alexander McSween, gets into legal trouble with L.G. Murphy and Company, predominantly because of squabbling over the insurance policy for this man, Emil Fritz, who was L.G. Murphy's original business partner. He dies, and he has an insurance policy that needs to be collected. Alexander McSween is actually the lawyer for L.G. Murphy and Company, and before they have a falling out, he's collected over $30,000 worth of debts for them. So he's a good debt-collecting lawyer. That was his specialty. They have a falling out over this insurance policy, largely because while McSween is trying to collect the insurance policy, he's also trying to, circumnavigate the house and L.G. Murphy and basically take over their businesses. So in the end, he manages to collect the full amount. The actual, the money itself, the question of who it goes to, the heirs, becomes an issue. And John Tunstall is just right in the middle of this entire problem. At the same time, the Santa Fe ring is going after John Chisholm. John Chisholm is smart, though. He basically gets rid of all of his assets. He divests himself of all of his assets. He sells his entire herd to a large cattle company called Hunter and Evans. So now, technically, he's running cattle for somebody else. Most of his fixed assets in this territory of New Mexico he signs over to his brothers. So he kind of removes himself from the ability of the Santa Fe ring to come after him legally. Alexander McSween, not so much. So, and again, John Tunstall was right in the middle of this because he's associated with both of these men. So, by January of 1878, McSween and Chisholm decided they need to leave the territory. They do so perfectly legally. In fact, McSween, because there's a lawsuit against him from L.G. Murphy and Company about this Fritz estate, he lets Warren Bristol know that he's leaving the territory, what he was supposed to do, and they head up to Las Vegas to catch a train heading east. And McSween and Chisholm are arrested on pretty much trumped up charges, especially in the case of Chisholm. They use some really obscure territorial legal thing to keep him in the territory. McSween posts bond and decides he's going to go to Mesilla and have a hearing about this whole thing and just sort it out in the legal system. Chisholm, again, being the smart one, doesn't pay his bond and remains in prison until March of 1878, basically during all the explosion of the beginning of the Lincoln County War. So he basically takes himself out of the violent period that's about to erupt and stays there for a while. So again, Tunstall is right in the middle of this. They head down in January or the early February of 1878. They head down to Mesilla for a hearing with Judge Warren Bristol. And this is one of the strangest hearings that has ever occurred in the territory. First of all, it was held in Warren Bristol's house, which is a little odd, presumably because he was recovering from maybe a bout of smallpox, which was ravaging the territory at the time. Also, nobody was forced or required to swear an oath, so they were not under oath at the time. And there was no documentation. Nobody was writing anything down. That was the biggest issue. And that's where John Tunstall really ran into trouble, because he goes to this hearing in Mesilla along with other people, and he testifies. And there's two very distinctive stories that come out of this. One side says that John Tunstall says, I am business partners with Alexander McSween. And that's a big problem because in the eyes of the law, that now means that McSween's property is Tunstall's property and vice versa. The other side of the story is he says the exact opposite. And even the deputy that is in charge of basically moving McSween around the territory at the time, a guy named Adolphe Berrier, says that Tunstall, in his affidavit that's given later, says that Tunstall said the exact opposite. I'm not business partners with Alexander McSween. We do not have a formal business. Regardless, the court heard what they wanted to hear. And at basically the same time this hearing is finished with no resolution, it's postponed to the next period court in April in Lincoln. The heirs of Emil Fritz come to Messia and they swear an affidavit that Alexander McSween owes them money. And what this allows the court to do is to rush ahead of Tunstall McSween back to Lincoln and put a writ of attachment on their property to make up for that money that they are saying that they owe him. And the amount is relatively small, but Sheriff William Brady begins attaching the property to the extent of about $40,000, essentially the entire Tunstall store. So John Tunstall shows back up in town, and these men are basically taking his property, even down to his family photographs. So there's a big argument about whether or not his property is that of McSween's and whether or not they're business partners. So the store itself is kind of left alone, but then he has other property, namely his cattle, which is down in his Feliz ranch. So a posse is put together and they are sent to the ranch to attach the cattle that are there. Initially, the posse is turned away on February 10th. The foreman of the ranch, Dick Brewer, and others who are there say, no, you don't understand, this is not Alexander McSween's property. And John Tunstall's property is not his property. And they require basically that they get a court order or something from Tunstall that says, yes, give them the cattle. So without incident, they leave. But they're brought back. They go down the Seven Rivers along the Pecos. They raise a bigger posse. And they come back. The man on the left is J.B. Matthews, who's kind of the head of the posse. And the man on the right is Dick Brewer, Richard M. Brewer, who was the foreman of Tunstall's ranch at the time. So on February 18th, they come back. But when they get there, there's nobody there except the cook, Godfrey Goss, who's there at the ranch. What had happened was John Tunstall heard that this posse was coming back. He gets back to Lincoln. He rides all the way down to John Chisholm's ranch to ask for help from his cowboys. John Chisholm is not there because he's sitting in a jail in Las Vegas, smartly, at that point, completely out of the situation. His brother Jim Chisholm says, I'm not going to help you. We're not going to give any of our Jingle Bob cowboys to you to get involved with this at the time. So Tunstall then rides all the way on February 17th from Roswell to his ranch along the Rio Feliz. A huge amount of time in the saddle. So by the time he gets there on the evening of February 17th, he's been in the saddle for almost well over 24 hours and ridden well over 200 miles. So he had to be extremely tired. He wakes up the next morning about 8:30, and here's what he tells his cowboys. He says, look, let them have the cattle. The deal is they got to stay here. We're going to leave a representative. He sends one of his cowboys, a guy named William McCloskey, to go get somebody else from the Seven Rivers posses to say, look, you leave a representative here, I'll leave a representative here, and we'll let the legal system work it out. But I'm going to take my horses with me. And the horse situation had already been finalized. The horses were not part of the attachment. He had worked that out with William Brady, the sheriff, already here in Lincoln. So he takes a number of his cowboys, including William Bonney, John Middleton, Richard Brewer, Fred Waite. They head up the canyon or head up towards Lincoln on the morning of February 18th. So the posse gets to Tunstall Ranch not very long after they leave. And Godfrey Goss tells them exactly what John Tunstall said about the cattle, and a sub-posse is formed. And this sub-posse, on the orders of Jimmy Dolan, you track down and ostensibly take the horses back, which are not part of the detachment. There's no warrant for the arrest of John Tunstall. He has no real legal right to even go after them. Among the members of this posse are a bunch of people from the Seven Rivers area, some from Lincoln, but at the last minute, 3 men, known outlaws, members of the Boys, the rustling gang that operates here in Lincoln, joined the posse. Jesse Evans, Frank Baker, and Tom Hill. And these 3 men are known outlaws. They joined the posse. They're never officially listed as the posse, but they are there nonetheless. So, there's no doubt in my mind that John Tunstall and his cowboys are not in any hurry to get up back to Lincoln. Because as far as John Tunstall is concerned, he's done nothing wrong. The horses aren't part of the attachment. He doesn't need a hurry. So they're moving along, and about 5 o'clock that night, they're overtaken by the posse, and John Tunstall is killed. We'll leave that story there. We'll talk more about the details when we get up to the murder site. But the aftermath of this whole thing is pretty amazing. The death of John Tunstall, it can be argued that the Lincoln County War had been brewing for years, and that's absolutely true. And it can be argued that it went on after even Billy the Kid was killed in 1881. But the death of John Tunstall did spark the largest and most condensed period of violence in the Lincoln County War. And more importantly, probably, what it did was it alerted the federal government as to the issues that were going on in territorial New Mexico. So, largely because John Tunstall was a British citizen, as soon as he dies, letters start flying all over the world, to Canada, to England, to his parents, and eventually to Washington, D.C. And very quickly, the British ambassador or minister to the United States, Edward Thornton, gets involved. And all of a sudden, Rutherford B. Hayes and the Secretary of State and the Attorney General for the United States, they're starting to get letters on their desk from the minister saying, hey, your territorial officials were complicit and involved in the murder of one of our citizens. That's a pretty serious offense. It's not just saying he was killed here, it's saying that your territorial officials were involved in the murder of one of our citizens. And that leads to a series of investigations. Probably the most important here in Lincoln involves a special investigator named Frank Warner Angel. He comes here during the summer of 1878 and takes down information related to all sorts of corruption that's going on in the state, but largely here in Lincoln County. And that information that I gave you guys those are affidavits taken during the Angel report. He goes back, he submits his report to the Attorney General and the President of the United States, and it largely is the reasoning for the removal of a number of territorial officials in the fall of 1878, including Samuel Axtell, the territorial government, who was replaced by Lew Wallace, the new territorial government. So the murder of John Tunstall led directly to that. Not to mention the bloody and violent period of the Lincoln County War that happened between February of 1878 and the 5-day battle here in Lincoln in July of 1878, and the death of Alexander McSween as well. They left his ranch about 8:30 in the morning on February 18th and kind of took their time. When they left, it was John Tunstall, Fred Tecumseh Waite, William Bonney, John Middleton, Dick Brewer, and Robert Whitman. At the time, besides being John Tunstall's best friend, was also a U.S. Marshal at the time. They all left. Fred Waite broke off from the group within about 5 miles because he was driving a wagon. And this route, they wanted to get back to Lincoln as quickly as possible, but they weren't in a rush. They had no reason to believe that there was a posse after them because they were doing nothing illegal or wrong. Like I said, the horses that they were moving from there to Lincoln, those had already been cleared by William Brady from not being part of the attachment. In fact, they had already been driven a few days earlier from Lincoln to the ranch after they had been decided that it wasn't part of the things that were going to be attached. So they were not in any way, shape, or form worried about being tracked down by a posse. So about right here, so you see there's a ridge here, and then it goes down into what's now called Tunstall Canyon. At that point it was not, obviously. So if you read the reports, Dick Brewer and Robert Whitman and John Tunstall were already down inside of the canyon. And they were down near, and we'll see down when we get down there, there's a dry riverbed or dry creek bed. And it's most likely they were somewhere right in there, which is also happens to be where the marker is, because Robert Whitman and Dick Brewer broke off from him to go chase turkeys, of all things. John Tunstall, for whatever, didn't go with them. He's probably mainly because he wasn't carrying a rifle. He never did. The only guns he ever carried was a British Bulldog pocket pistol. And at this point, he had bought a 5.5-inch silver-plated Colt single-action Army revolver that he carried. But at that, he didn't usually carry anything else. So Dick Brewer and Robert Whitman split off from him to go hunt these turkeys. The horses they were riding, obviously, were with them. There were a few other horses they were pushing up the canyon. But John Middleton and William Bonney, Billy the Kid, were riding a dragon. John Middleton is described by John Tunstall as being the toughest man that he had ever seen. He said he was, in his own words, he was probably capable of doing anything a ruffian would do. So of all the people in their group, John Middleton was the one that John Tunstall felt was the most rough, I guess, if you want to say that. So Middleton and Bonney were up on this ridge. Tunstall was down in the canyon with Dick Brewer and Middleton with left to get the turkeys. Bonney and Middleton look behind them, and there's a posse of about 20 people coming after them. That was how big the sub-posse was. The actual posse that ended up at the ranch had almost 40 people in it. 20 of them broke off to come after Tunstall with the horses. Again, it's important to remember, they had no warrant for his arrest. The horses were not part of the attachment. Jimmy Dolan had shown up at the ranch when kind of towards the end, when they were probably going to leave, and said, no, you guys need to go after Tunstall. And it was on his orders directly that this sub-posse was formed, including Frank Baker, Jesse Evans, and Tom Hill, these known outlaws. So William Bonney and John Middleton are on this ridge. They see and hear the posse coming. One from the posse and one from Tunstall's men. What Tunstall's men said, William Bonney and John Middleton, was the minute that the posse got over the ridge, they began firing at them, just indiscriminately. Didn't even say surrender, didn't say who they were, just started firing at them. So Bonney and Middleton took off down the canyon and passed John Tunstall. And John Middleton says he was the one who talked to him. As he was riding past him, he said, "John, run, John, run." And apparently Tunstall's last word to John Middleton was, "What, John? What, John?" And they kept going. So Dick Brewer heard the gunshots, and Robert Whitman, and they peeled off and ended up on a ridge, probably somewhere right on the other side of the draw. There's some outcroppings of rocks over there. So Middleton and Bonney kind of circled around and ended up back with Whitman and Brewer. And about that time, they heard 2 or 3 distinct shots from down in the canyon. They essentially knew that Tunstall was being killed. They didn't have to see the body to know that. The posse kind of looked around for the rest of the men and the horses, but they figured out that they were kind of in an entrenched situation, so they peeled off and headed out as well. Middleton, Brewer, Bonney, and Whitman then got on their horses without even going to check on John Tunstall's and went back to Lincoln to bring the news. So when they got back to Lincoln the next day, They came back out here with a local rancher named Newcomb. They also brought in a local Hispanic tracker, and they found the body, and that's when they found it kind of staged like it was. So Tunstall had been shot once in the upper chest, and it was a mortal wound. It had severed an artery. He had most likely fallen off his horse face first, and then shot in the back of the head from point blank range. Again, most likely with his own. When his body was found, he was laid on his back. Underneath, very neatly folded, was his overcoat. His pistol had 2 rounds missing in it, and it was in its holster. So the gun that he was carrying that day, and most likely the gun that was used to shoot and kill him, actually was sent back to his family, is still in their possession. It actually was on display at the Royal Armory in Leeds for a long time, but now it's back in the family's possession. His horse was shot as well, so probably, most likely, 1 bullet had been used on him and 1 bullet had been used on the horse. And his hat was placed under the horse's head in kind of a mocking way as well. And that was the way that they found the body. They retrieved it, put it on a wagon, and took it back to Lincoln where the autopsy was done. A lot of people ask, well, how do we know exactly where this was? The story goes, in the 1920s, Colonel Maurice G. Fulton, who is a Lincoln County War historian and one of the earliest real researchers on the subject, he met and found that tracker. He was still alive, and he brought him back to the site of where it was. But if you read the documents, and like the ones that I gave you, and there's many affidavits. So John Middleton was deposed, and William Bonney was deposed. Robert Widman was deposed, and they all told the exact same story essentially. If you read about the topography, this pretty much fits the bill exactly, especially when you get down there and you see that draw, because anyone who's ever hunted turkeys know, turkeys need water. So you're not going to find turkeys in an area without water, so there's this old dry creek right down there. The other side of the story says that the posse came over the ridge, they came down into the canyon, weren't firing at anybody. 3 of the men broke off, Tom Hill, Frank Baker, and Jesse Evans, along, and he goes back and forth, although he was dead within a month anyway. Buck Morton potentially was with them as well. They come along Tunstall, and what they say happened is Tunstall turned in his saddle. They said, hey, come here, we're not going to hurt you, we don't have any reason to, we're after the horses. And as he turned in his saddle, he began firing at them. That's what they said happened. They shot back and they killed him. That was their story. Unfortunately for everybody, the only people that were in the canyon with Tunstall at that moment were Tom Hill, Frank Baker, Buck Morton, and Jesse Evans. That was it. So all of Tunstall's men were out of line of sight. And within a very short amount of time, Tom Hill was killed while trying to rob a sheep herder down at Shedd's Ranch very soon after. Buck Morton and Frank Baker were killed by the regulators up in the Capitan foothills, basically out of vengeance for this within a month of this. And Jesse Evans was shot and wounded at the same place where Tom Hill was killed, incarcerated at Fort Stanton, and never ever was deposed or told his story. Of course, never admitted that